The road leading to Ashmore House was a narrow, twisting path that snaked through the dense forest, the trees growing so close together that their branches intertwined overhead, forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the branches, like the whisper of some unseen presence. Jacob stared out the car window as his wife, Claire, drove them deeper into the woods. The GPS showed only a thin, meandering line that indicated the road, but no other signs of life. There were no other cars, no houses, not even a stray hiker. It was as if they were driving into the very heart of nowhere.
How much longer?
Claire asked, her voice cutting through the silence.
Another 15 minutes, according to the directions.
Jacob replied, checking his phone. The battery was low, and there was no signal. He turned it off, knowing it wouldn't be of any use out here. Claire sighed, glancing at him with a mix of exhaustion and concern.
You sure about this place? It's pretty far out, and, well, it's pretty remote.
I know, but it's exactly what we need right now. A break from everything. Just the two of us, away from all the noise.
Claire nodded, but he could see the unease in her eyes. It had been a tough year for both of them. After Jacob's father passed away, he had been struggling with the grief, the weight of responsibilities, and the unspoken distance that had grown between them. This trip was supposed to be a chance to reconnect, to heal. A friend had recommended the place, saying it was the perfect getaway, secluded, peaceful, and steeped in history. But as the trees closed in around them and the light began to fade, Jacob wondered if they had made a mistake. When they finally arrived at Ashmore House, the sight of it took Jacob's breath away. The house was massive, a sprawling Gothic structure with tall, narrow windows and steep gables. The stone walls were darkened with age, and ivy crept up the sides like fingers reaching toward the sky. The roof was slate, and several of the shingles were missing, leaving gaping holes that seemed to stare down at them like empty eye sockets. When they finally arrived at Ashmore House, the sight of it took Jacob's breath away. The house was massive, a sprawling Gothic structure with tall, narrow windows and steep gables. The stone walls were darkened with age, and ivy crept up the sides like fingers reaching toward the sky. The roof was slate, and several of the shingles were missing, leaving gaping holes that seemed to stare down at them like empty eye sockets. The house was beautiful in a grim sort of way, but there was something about it that set Jacob on edge. It felt too quiet, too still, as if the entire forest had gone silent in the presence of the house. Claire parked the car in front of the house, and they both sat there for a moment, staring at the imposing structure before them.
Well,
Claire said, forcing a smile.
Here we are.
Jacob nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The air was cool, and the sky was overcast, the light fading fast. The front door was heavy and solid, made of dark wood with iron bands. It creaked as Jacob pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty house like a warning. The inside was dim, the only light coming from the few narrow windows. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the weak sunlight that filtered through the trees outside. The entryway was large, with a sweeping staircase leading up to the second floor. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the floor was covered in a threadbare carpet that must have once been elegant but was now worn and faded. A large, ornate chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by years of neglect. His footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The air was cool and musty, with a faint smell of something he couldn't quite place, something old, decaying.
It's bigger than I expected.
Claire said, her voice echoing slightly. Jacob nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat.
Let's look around, see what we've got.
They moved through the house together, exploring the rooms one by one. The ground floor was a labyrinth of interconnected spaces. A grand dining room with a long, polished table and high-backed chairs. A sitting room with faded, velvet furniture and a cold, empty fireplace. A library filled with dusty, leather-bound books. And a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Every room was filled with the remnants of a life long forgotten, as if the house had been frozen in time. There were cobwebs in the corners, dust on every surface, and a sense of abandonment that clung to every object, every shadow. But it wasn't just the state of disrepair that unnerved Jacob. It was the feeling that they were not alone. He couldn't shake the sensation that there were eyes on him, watching from the darkness, from the corners where the light didn't reach. They reached the second floor, where the bedrooms were located. The master bedroom was large, with a four-poster bed draped in heavy, moth-eaten curtains. The windows were tall and narrow, letting in only a sliver of light, and the air was even colder here than it had been downstairs. Claire shivered and wrapped her arms around herself.
This place gives me the creeps.
It's just old.
Jacob said, trying to sound reassuring.
It'll feel better once we get settled in.
But as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. They unpacked their bags in the master bedroom, setting their clothes in the dusty wardrobe and laying their toiletries out on the old, cracked vanity. Jacob found a stack of blankets in the closet and spread them over the bed, hoping to ward off the chill that seemed to seep from the walls. As the evening wore on, the light continued to fade, and the house grew darker, the shadows lengthening and deepening until it was difficult to see more than a few feet in front of them. Jacob lit a few candles he had brought with them, setting them around the room to create a warm, flickering glow. But even the candlelight couldn't chase away the oppressive feeling that hung over the house like a shroud. They decided to explore the grounds before it got too dark. Outside, the air was cool and damp, and the trees cast long, spindly shadows across the overgrown lawn. There was a small garden in the back, enclosed by a crumbling stone wall. Inside, the weeds had taken over, choking out any flowers that might have once bloomed there. Beyond the garden was a small cemetery, the headstones worn and tilted at odd angles, their inscriptions barely legible. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine as he stood there, staring at the graves. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that there was something just out of sight, hiding in the shadows.
Let's go back inside.
Jacob nodded, and they made their way back to the house, the sense of unease growing with every step. That night, they sat in the sitting room, trying to make conversation, but the words felt hollow, forced. The house seemed to absorb the sound, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. When they finally went to bed, the silence followed them, pressing down on them like a weight. Jacob lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of the house, of its history, of the people who had once lived here. He had done some research before they arrived, but there was little information available. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family, the Ashmores, who had lived there for several generations. But the last of the Ashmores had died in the early 1900s, and the house had been abandoned ever since. There were rumors, of course, whispers of tragedy and death, but nothing concrete. It was as if the house's past had been deliberately erased, leaving only the barest traces behind. As he lay there, Jacob began to hear something, a faint sound like the creaking of floorboards or the whisper of fabric against wood. He held his breath, listening intently, but the sound stopped as soon as it had begun. He exhaled slowly, telling himself it was just the house settling, just the wind. But the unease gnawed at him, keeping him awake long into the night. The next day, the weather turned. The sky was dark and heavy with clouds, and a steady rain began to fall, drumming against the windows and turning the ground outside to mud. The house felt even more isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by the relentless downpour. Jacob and Claire spent the day inside, trying. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windows, a constant, drumming rhythm that only deepened the sense of isolation that had settled over Ashmore House. The day was bleak, and inside the old mansion, the atmosphere had grown even more oppressive. The flickering candlelight seemed feeble against the encroaching darkness that seeped from every corner of the ancient structure. Jacob and Claire spent the morning in uneasy silence, each lost in their thoughts. The house, with its endless maze of rooms and corridors, had an unsettling way of warping their sense of time. Hours felt like days, and the rain only made the minutes crawl slower. There was no way to tell if it was morning or afternoon. The sky outside remained a uniform, stormy gray.
Let's light a fire.
Jacob suggested, trying to break the tension.
It'll warm the place up, make it feel more homey.
Claire nodded, though she remained quiet, her unease palpable. Together, they gathered what little dry wood they could find and piled it into the cold, unused fireplace in the sitting room. Jacob struck a match and touched it to the kindling. The flames took hold slowly, crackling as they consumed the dry wood. But even as the fire grew, casting flickering shadows across the walls, it did little to chase away the pervasive chill that clung to the air. The room, once the heart of the house, felt like a hollow shell, devoid of life or warmth. As they sat before the fire, Claire finally broke the silence.
I keep hearing things at night. It's like whispers or footsteps. But when I get up to check, there's nothing there.